Good afternoon. My name is Matt Howard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Virtru. We are a data encryption and access control company with more than 7,000 customers, many of whom operate in the defense industrial base. For the record, we, Virtru, certainly myself included, are not experts in CMMC, which is why we're so excited today to bring to you this conversation facilitated by three gentlemen who have indeed lots of expertise as it relates to CMMC. So I'm going to start off by letting them introduce themselves as I welcome you to the webinar today, Understanding and Charting Your Path Forward with CMMC 2.0. Stuart, why don't you start with an introduction?
Well, very good, Matt. Thank you. My name is Stuart Itken, and I'm the Vice President for CMMC and FedRAMP Assurance for Coalfire Federal. Coalfire Federal supports the cyber and the cloud security requirements of both government and commercial organizations. We are an authorized CMMC third-party assessment organization. We are also a CMMC registered provider organization, which means that we're providing both advisory services as well as assessment services to organizations across the defense industrial base in support of CMMC. As an organization, we've been involved with CMMC really since its inception, being involved in the formation of the CMMC accreditation body, now the CMMC, or I'm sorry, the Cyber AB, and have been involved in a number of the working groups that were established to help build the framework and the program. Coalfire is also the largest FedRAMP 3PAO, having supported over 30% of all of the ATOs on the FedRAMP marketplace. Prior to joining Coalfire, I had been with an organization called ExoStar, where I had the opportunity to work extensively across the defense industrial base with both primes and suppliers. Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, Raytheon Technologies were the owners of ExoStar at that particular point in time, and certainly excited to be here and share some of our experience and knowledge with respect to CMMC today.
Thank you very much, Stuart. David London.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to Virtru for having us. My name is David London. I'm a managing director at the Chertoff Group. The Chertoff Group is a security risk management advisory firm based in Washington, D.C., and founded by the former Homeland Security Secretary. And in founding our firm, wanted to bring the knowledge, experience, and context from protecting and securing government infrastructure into the private sector. So we work solely with commercial organizations, helping them assess, build, and monitor and communicate security risk, both on the physical security and cybersecurity side. I've been with the firm for about 8 years. We are a registered provider organization. Unlike Stuart, we are not a 3PAO. We help our clients navigate CMMC when there are adjacencies to other engagements through our federal strategy, our geopolitical risk, and CFIUS and FOCI mitigation practices. Prior to my time at Chertoff, I spent about 8 years at Booz Allen Hamilton. My focus there was on cyber preparedness, both within the U.S. DoD, government civilian agency, and commercial sector in cybersecurity wargaming exercises and building muscle memory around cyber preparedness and responsiveness. Thanks again for inviting me, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, David, very much for being here. And I'm very excited to introduce to you as well Patrick O'Brien, who is actually representing a member of the DIB, conducting business on behalf of the federal government, and himself sort of familiar as a practitioner with CMMC. Patrick, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us. My name is Patrick O'Brien. I'm currently the CIO of Summit Federal Services, which, although it's a new company administratively, it's really the culmination of a few legacy companies rolling into our current organization, all dealing with the federal government over the years. We primarily help DoD agencies, also some civil in areas such as program management, acquisition, administrative support, training services, those sorts of things. I started out at NSA as a computer systems analyst, been with the intelligence community most of my career or associated with it somehow, moved into law enforcement as a DCIS special agent. I investigated computer crime, and then came back into the contracting and consulting world with the likes of Booz Allen, SAIC, Northrop Grumman, and those sorts of firms, focusing on information assurance. Then I kind of pivoted to information sharing and ended up in the CIO's office of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, helping him in his effort to pull the dots together after 9/11. But since then, I've kind of pivoted to the small business world. Like I said, I'm in a DIB small business right now, and I've helped them and some small businesses moving into the cloud or even being born in the cloud. My niche in particular is Google Workspace. It's kind of where I'm coming from in looking at CMMC, and hopefully that'll be of some insight to at least some of our viewers today. Thanks, Matt.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Patrick, for being here. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, so I am the furthest thing from an expert on CMMC. I know enough to be dangerous based on what I've read and sort of consumed over the last sort of 9 months. That said, I have had the opportunity to talk to dozens and dozens of real world sort of small and medium, in certain cases, large integrators working in the DIB, doing important contracting on behalf of the federal government. And all of them are, as many of you would expect, wrestling with this question of, what exactly is CMMC and what does it mean to me? So I want to start off with Stuart. And Stuart, if you don't mind, clearly you are an expert steeped in CMMC. How would you explain in a nutshell CMMC if you were kind of talking to someone fresh, cold, who doesn't really know much? How would you explain it in a nutshell?
I think, thank you, Matt. And I think it's important for people to understand why CMMC exists to first, or to be able to understand then what it is. But the problem that it addresses was identified by former Undersecretary of State or Secretary of Defense Ellen Lord as a national security imperative. And kind of in essence, a tremendous amount of classified and unclassified information, critical defense information, is stolen every single year from members of the supply chain to the DoD. And it's not being stolen from Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman. Their cyber maturity is exceptionally high. Their cyber defenses are exceptionally strong. It's those that are 2, 3, 4 tiers down within the supply chain that don't have the cyber maturity who are more vulnerable, and from whom this information is being stolen by the Chinese, by the Russians, by the Iranians, and others. And what's the impact of this? Well, it really diminishes the technological advantage that the United States has enjoyed for quite some time. When we invest $1 trillion in a program like the F-35, which takes a decade to develop, and then find 2 years after its development that the Chinese launch literally a carbon copy of that plane, the advantage that we expected to have is severely diminished. When that information is stolen and our adversaries understand how our weapon systems work, the effectivity of those weapon systems is severely compromised. And what's that mean? We're putting our warfighters in peril, and ultimately we're affecting the security of our nation, and certainly something that affects every single one of us. Why does this exist? Earlier attempts to be able to kind of prevent the loss of information from members within the defense industrial base just proved ineffective. The former regulation, NIST 800-171, was enacted as a requirement in December of 2017. And so this is not a new requirement. In fact, it's a requirement that organizations in the defense industrial base have been self-attesting to really since that time. The problem is that kind of the law isn't what is written, it's what's enforced. And 800-171 was enforced through self-attestation. I kind of graded my own homework and said, yep, I think I passed. And in some cases, organizations just simply said, let me sign on the bottom line. The other was that organizations could satisfy security requirements with what are referred to as POAMs, or plans of actions and milestones. So rather than having put security in place, it was a promise to put security in place that seldom got followed through on. And so, the net of this is, the recognition of this as a problem isn't new, but the recognition that what we've tried to do to address it has been ineffective. And so CMMC was developed specifically to address the shortcomings of the enforcement of NIST 800-171, and to really address this very critical issue of curtailing the theft of information from suppliers across the defense industrial base, diminishing our national security posture.
Yeah, so super helpful. I'm going to ask you one quick yes/no question. So you say self-attestation, didn't work. POAMs, plans, talk is cheap. Is it fair, yes or no, to sort of look at CMMC today and view it as it's time to put up with respect to improving cybersecurity maturity? Is that fair?
I think that's exactly it. I was at an event last week with Stacy Bosjanek, who's the deputy DoD CIO for the implementation of the CMMC program. And the way she put it is that, we never graded people's homework. And so people felt that they didn't really need to turn it in and get it done. With CMMC, everybody's homework is going to be graded. There'll be a third party that is going to come in and verify that every one of the 110 controls, the 320 requirements under those 110 controls have all been satisfied. And ultimately what this does is it creates a minimum threshold of cybersecurity that the DoD believes is required for any organization to be entrusted with sensitive defense information.
Yep, super helpful. David, macro level, how would you explain CMMC from your perspective, from Chertoff's perspective, to someone not super familiar with it? Why does it matter? How would you explain it?
Sure, thanks, Matt. I'd certainly not going to outsmart Stuart on this, who's working, these issues daily. I mean, I think as we have been observing the, kind of gyrations of CMMC over the last several years, one way to characterize it is around kind of ambiguity, because, it is as Stuart has alluded to, a massive undertaking to begin setting a minimum baseline standard, for the DIB. Now, I think there is also an acknowledgement that 800-171 is not a new, set of requirements or controls, but trying to build and drive a level of more transparency, rigor, and validation around that is a significant undertaking. I think it's also really important for the community to understand the evolution of CMMC between 1.0 and 2.0. And I think overall, this kind of evolution to 2.0 is a positive development, both for the DIB as well as for the government stakeholders that will ultimately be in charge of ensuring kind of program effectiveness and success. And so we went from a kind of regime of 5 certification levels, also oriented around 800-171, but as you move to a kind of higher level of risk exposure, the expectation around the number of controls increased. There was still sort of third-party assessment required, but there was also another layer around the 1.0, which created a lot of consternation, which was around a set of unique practices and maturity around those unique practices, and a number of questions around how that level of maturity would be assessed and graded and reported. So in 2.0, that process has been significantly streamlined. Now there are 3 certification levels. Most within I actually would ask my kind of fellow panelists how it breaks down, but I think the center of gravity is going to be around level 2, where you are, as Stuart indicated, really focused around the 110, security controls and security requirements within 800-171. There is the reintroduction, actually, of some level of self-assessment for level 2. Back to the ambiguity piece, though, still unclear who will be kind of empowered to conduct self-assessments on an annual basis, with likely kind of outside third-party assessments every 3rd year. But I think, you know, overall organizations have, I wouldn't say fully exhaled, but at least kind of had a collective sigh of relief with that level of kind of streamlining and transparency that's occurring as we evolve to a 2.0 version of CMMC.
Thanks, David. That's super interesting perspective. I think the comment about ambiguity is helpful. The concept of a journey comes to mind, and you know, Patrick, you know, being the CIO for you know, a company that's contracting on behalf of the government and firmly sort of in the midst of, you know, you're part of the DIB community. What does CMMC mean to you? Where does the rubber really hit the road with respect to someone like yourself who's operating a business like yours in the DIB supporting the government?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, a little bit of a different perspective here than my colleagues. We're down the foxhole. We're on the receiving end of this, and we're availing ourselves of services like David and Stuart's organizations provide. So what we're gleaning from this is we now believe that this is the real deal. It's not another fire drill. Anybody who's been around, you know, this space the last 5+ years realizes that some things come and go, and you sometimes sit back and wait for it to keep going by, and we don't always need to jump on the train, right? Because there's another train behind it. Well, this train is really going to be stopping at all the stations. We're going to have to jump on and ride this train. Now, we are, even within CMMC, we've been getting used to a couple of stops and starts, right? Version 1.0, version 2.0. The rules are still coming out. They're getting the infrastructure set up. But I think it's clear the timeline on this is real. It's definitive. It's got a lot of traction. They're investing a lot in it, and we are all going to have to comply with it. I think you know, the worst case that anyone who does jump on this train is going to experience, if you do, you know, buy into this, which we're all going to need to, even if you're pessimistic about the outcome, it's a win-win. You know, you're gonna get your arms around 800/171. You're gonna, you know, be in a good place with DFARS. Your security posture is going to be better. You will be ready when CMMC does come of age and everybody's on the hook for it. And as far as the self-attestation, I'll wait until the next question to talk about that a little bit more. But you know, if you self-attest that you are compliant and that's not the case, you could be hit with a false claims action. And I believe there was talk of one in the news recently about someone, you know, some of the officials starting an action on false claims. So that's not just that's not vapor yet either. So again, it's a win-win. It's here. We're going to have to deal with it. And if you want to keep doing business with the federal government.
Thanks, Patrick. Super helpful. You know, Stuart, he mentioned this concept of when CMMC comes of age. I'm curious from your perspective, is CMMC right now if we're using a metaphor, is it a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old? And I'd love to get your perspective on what does CMMC look like 12 months from now? What's your best guess? Does it kind of grow up into a, you know, an elementary school student? You know, like what's the picture today with respect to CMMC, and what does it look like 12 months from now?
So I think, you know, the program is still, you know, somewhat pre-nascent. We've hit 2 really important milestones. One involves the rulemaking that creates CMMC, and the other is around enabling organizations within the DIB to go through and have assessments, or for assessments to be able to begin. The rulemaking process started, you know, well, you know, at the end of last year. And that point, the DoD said it was going to take 9 to 24 months. They provided a timeline, and you know, unusual that timeline has actually moved to the left. I don't think I've ever said move to the left before in the context of a government program, but originally the expectation was that the rule would be published for comment, published as an interim rule in May of 23. It is now on track to be published in March of 23. And why is that important? The process is such that it was just recently submitted for interagency review within the DoD. Again, right on time. It will bring it to the point where in March, it gets published as an interim rule for public comment. But as an interim rule, it has a 60-day review period at which time it goes into effect. And so effectively, when we look at this and how it's rolling out, CMMC, or the new DFARS clause, which will authorize CMMC, which will enable the government to include CMMC requirements in contracts, expect that to see that in May of next year. In the interim, the government has said, we don't want to wait. This is still a problem. Information is still being stolen from suppliers within the defense industrial base. So a program was recently initiated. It was initiated in August called Joint Surveillance Assessments. These are kind of voluntary, kind of early adopter CMMC assessments. They're being conducted jointly by the DIBCAC and by C3PAOs. Probably not worth getting into the details here, but effectively for organizations that say, I really want to get started with this now because it's important. It's a means for them to be able to go through, complete the assessment process, and then once that DFARS rule becomes effective, this interim assessment will become automatically a CMMC certification that will be good for a period of 3 years. So kind of in net, the two big things that have evolved, interim assessments having started and picking up in volume, rulemaking progressing. We'll expect to see that rule become effective as an interim rule next year in May, which means the government will start including CMMC requirements in contracts. It won't be flip the light switch. Every contract, every renewal will require CMMC. It will start to be put in and will start to roll out. But it's a matter of, again, an individual organization won't know whether the contract they're bidding on or the contract that's about to renew is going to require CMMC. And CMMC it's binary. You either have it or you don't. And if you have it, you're eligible to be able to participate in a contract that has that as a requirement. And if you don't have it, you're just not eligible to participate on that contract. So this will continue to evolve, and over the next year, I expect we will see more and more contracts that will include CMMC requirements, and again, a wholesale migration of organizations adopting CMMC.
So David, the train is coming. It's coming down the tracks. There's probably no scenario in which it stops. And a year from now, CMMC is going to be a requirement for a certain number of contracts. And contractors in the DIB, if they want to bid on those contracts, are going to have CMMC. And if they don't, they're not going to be able to bid. What does that really mean to our country? What does it mean to our Defense Department? What does it mean to us as taxpayers with respect to our cybersecurity risk posture? Does the world get better as a result of all this?
Ostensibly, Matt. I mean, Stuart, I think, did a nice job of laying out the overall kind of risk surface and the implications and impacts of the gaps and seams, cybersecurity gaps and seams, and lack of hygiene in where organizations are not properly kind of secure and hardened. Just to kind of dovetail on a couple of things that Stuart said around what we can expect over the next year, ideally kind of crystallizing some of the existing ambiguity. I think what organizations can do, as the rulemaking takes hold, is right now there is a CMMC assessment process document, which is public. Over the next, in March, it is expected that will be finalized. So that's a document for 3PAOs, registered providers, to help kind of build a level of kind of scale, but also formalizing, the assessment process. But that's obviously particularly, instructive as well for the DIB and other organizations on how, what the measuring stick looks like and how organizations, will be assessed. I mean, I think there's also a bit of a moving target here as we think about, 2.0 has created, a level of transparency around how organizations and the DIB will be measured. But there is on the horizon a 800-171, just to kind of muddy the waters, version 3 on the horizon. And so there will be, however incremental, there will be, some changes to the to how organizations will be managed and measured as far as the kind of controls, capabilities, and countermeasures that are in place. I'd also say that organizations should start familiarizing themselves with the cyber AD and that kind of overall ecosystem. In recent webinars with Matt Travis, who leads the CMMC AB, there is a level of palpable frustration within the DIB, and I think also he shares it, that kind of ecosystem has not kind of fully matured as much as he would like, as much as other organizations would like. Back at RSA, he had reported that there were only 15 or 16 registered 3PAOs. That number has increased, but I still don't think it's adequate. Stuart can certainly kind of comment on this as well as Patrick, but it's not adequate when this program becomes operational to truly absorb the kind of level of demand around those third-party assessments. I think to your broader point, Matt, when we start thinking about okay, what does this do to reduce risk? Stuart, Patrick have already kind of foot stomped that 800-171, those cybersecurity kind of baseline foundational cybersecurity capabilities should already be in place within the DIB, obviously for beyond compliance, but for just overall kind of threat-informed defense, and risk reduction. And when you think about some of those kind of core controls with 871, they dovetail with other, both with true kind of cybersecurity hygiene, but also around some of the heightened expectations that DIB organizations as well as the broader private sector are going to encounter with insurance carriers. We have a number of our clients right now whose carriers are denying them coverage because those baseline capabilities around endpoint detection, data protection and data security, core kind of access controls and two-factor authentication. These are expectations within 800-171. They're expectations among insurance carriers. They are kind of foot stomped significantly within President Biden's cyber executive order released of March last year. So that kind of convergence and confluence of all these expectations coupled with this heightened kind of threat environment, growing sophistication of threat actors should be, increase the demand for aligning to 800-171 beyond just what the CMMC is seeking to drive into the DIB programs.
Yes. So Patrick, it's interesting to hear the commentary from David and Stuart both, and I think I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on this question, which is you're in the DIB, you're competing for contracts, you're doing your best with the resources you have to protect sensitive information that needs to be protected in the scope of our national interest. You're also trying to align with CMMC, and in 12 months' time, what does that picture look like for you? Do you think Summit Federal and your organization is more competitive in 12 months' time because your ability to accomplish that? Do you see more contracts that you're going to be able to bid on and potentially win as a result of being sort of on the forefront of this? And how do you think about CMMC in terms of a competitive advantage versus just kind of doing the right thing?
Right. Well, both. Absolutely. It is doing the right thing, and this, like David said, this should not be anything organizations are just starting to do right now. We keep coming back to 800-171. Even if you have put in a SPURS score that may be a little bit optimistic, it shows that you are at least familiar with the controls. Everyone should be familiar with those basic controls and requirements and have those things in place. So this should not be a surprise. I would even go so far as to say, if this is a surprise to any organization, they're probably not in the right place, and we may not want them protecting our national security information. And it will be a distinguishing factor. If you can claim that you are in the queue for an assessment, or you've gone through a voluntary assessment, and you have a registered consultant working with you, and they have a certain level of comfort with your status, you know, that's going to help. But when you can show that you have a certification or have been through the voluntary assessment, that will definitely be a distinguishing factor in winning contracts, and it will be, of course, required, as we're all saying, in perhaps fewer than 12 months and maybe before, depending on, you know, which contracts are the first ones to get that in the DFARS.
Yeah.
Can I just, Matt, just add something to what, you know, what David had said in terms of the evolution of the program as well. I mean, you know, we look at 800-171, it was developed in 2015. In 2015, cloud architecture was very different. Organizations were still largely perimeter-based, and 800-171 is written more for perimeter-based architecture than it is for cloud. Again, zero trust and zero mention of zero trust in 2015. So, you know, the program needs to evolve. You know, just as architecture and technology has changed, the threat and landscape, the threat environment, you know, has been evolving and changing. And, you know, when we talk about CMMC in terms of will this secure the DIB, the answer is it's a really good start. It probably gives us a baseline, but not the finish line. There's still lots to be done.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And just being conscious of time here, I wanted to sort of turn to some questions from the audience and just kind of reflect on the comments that were just made. Certainly, while I'm far from a CMMC expert, and I don't live my life every day inside of the DIB like you know, the three of you do in some respects, I do know that cybersecurity hygiene and best practice for any organization in any part of the economy is incredibly difficult. The game is constantly changing, the pace of change, the threat actors that are out there, the sophistication, the architectures underpinning the way we do business, the way we implement security, as you mentioned, Stuart, has fundamentally changed in arguably the blink of an eye, from perimeter-based security to kind of cloud native and deperimeterized everything. Zero trust is a thing. It's a thing in the last, 2 years tops. So when we reflect on all of that, I'm kind of curious, kind of get your sort of honest, practical advice. And I'll start with Patrick. What is the number one thing that someone in the DIB can do today to begin to progress their journey on maturing cybersecurity hygiene and aligning with the DIB? A, for the purpose of doing the right thing, and B, for the purpose of being more competitive as more and more contracts then have this CMMC requirement. What's the one thing they can do today just to start to progress their maturity?
Okay, well, you limited me to one thing. I kind of thought 3 things to start with. We'll just say one thing has 3 parts. The first is what we've been singing here all along. Get out 800-171 and make sure you are fulfilling those 110 controls and working through that. If you are already on that path, then get out your list of POAMs and start knocking those out. Because while we've talked about POAMs, you know, not being in version 1 of CMMC, and they kind of keep back in with version 2, I think the powers that be have made it crystal clear that they are not here to stay, and POAMs are going to be A, limited, B, much better policed, and C, this is my personal opinion, they won't be around forever. I get the feeling that this was an offering to get us down the road in CMMC version 2. And if there's a version 3, I would not be surprised if POAMs aren't there anymore after we've kind of graduated through this transition period. So that's the second part, is work through your POAMs, because you will be on the hook for them. And the third is to cozy up to a great consultant. There's a couple of folks here on the call. There are other organizations. We use an outfit called Neosystems Corporation. They're great, very professional and thorough, but whoever you use, get someone who's experienced, thorough, and an expert in your field, preferably on your platform, and they will, you know, Sherpa you through this process. They have a lot more experience, and they've seen the lessons learned from other organizations. Their learning can help you get down that road a little further. And just one point about the self-attestation, which again, was kind of an olive branch, I believe, from version 1 to 2. They allowed for some of that on a limited basis. I don't think that's going to stick around forever. But if you are in a position where you do choose to self-attest at either level 1 or parts of level 2, you are really on the hook for making sure that what you say is true. You should believe that it will be checked, and the CEO or the CIO will be on the hook for liability if that is not the case. And before that may have just been an administrative, digital signature, but now it's something we are really going to have to work with.
Yeah, for sure. So David, macro perspective, risk sort of management. Cyber's hard, really hard. It's daunting. In many respects, it kind of makes me sometimes want to just cry and crawl up in a corner and just, put my head in the ground. I'm curious to get your perspective with regard to the rapidly changing nature of the game itself and the rapidly changing nature of the risk. How do organizations sort of, contend with this idea of zero trust all of a sudden out of the blue? It's no longer about a perimeter. I mean, you can do so much with identities and multi-factors. You can do your endpoint, you can do your network, you can secure your applications. How do you think about the transition to this kind of cloud first world and this new architecture that underpins the way most organizations operate and sort of incorporate zero trust security controls into that picture as part of the CMMC maturation process? Like, how important is the data in the scope of that transition?
Yeah, it's a great question, Matt, and we are big evangelists for threat-informed defense. We believe that is paramount to compliance. We all know, we've all seen a number of kind of high-profile breaches within our environment where they are ISO 27000 compliant, where they have any number of different certifications and adherence or alignment, and so you can still apply threat-informed defense while also addressing a number of CMMC kind of requirements. For example, within 800-171, there is a section around system and communications protection, and so that is employing kind of architectural designs and software development techniques and overall system engineering principles that safeguard the environment. Okay, how do you address that? How do you build threat-informed defense and zero trust, and how do you do that without boiling the ocean? And so one way we believe it's effective, again, we're threat-informed defense evangelists, we're also evangelists of the MITRE attack knowledge base. For those that aren't familiar with that, that is what we believe is kind of the most exhaustive sort of encyclopedia and periodic table and inventory of not only threat actors, but threat behaviors. And so organizations can achieve both a level of kind of visibility into the threat actors that don't target everybody, but target the DIB, for example, and overlay that and express that through MITRE attack, and then overlay their own kind of security controls and capabilities to understand where their gaps are. And in doing so, that you can map that to 800-171 requirements, so you're overlaying threat-informed defense on top of the kind of compliance requirements you may have through CMMC. So that's, and you look at that through several lenses. You can look at that through traditional enterprise architecture. You can look at that through SaaS through SaaS services. Look at that through infrastructure as a service. So you're getting broader control and countermeasure-based coverage that is threat-informed. I'd also say, as organizations, just to kind of reinforce what Patrick said around finding, good partners. Right now, the Cyber AB, has a number of providers. We believe the level of vetting, you're not necessarily going to end up with an organization as qualified as Coalfire and Stewart. And so organizations really need to do their due diligence, talk to colleagues, talk to peers, talk to folks like Patrick in the DIB, to understand who the organizations are that you can really trust as you kind of enter that journey to find the most trusted kind of incredible partner to take that journey with you. You're paying good money to get that level of kind of assistance and support. So you want to make sure that that you can really trust it. And while the Cyber AB is that kind of clearinghouse for that support, you're going to need to provide a kind of another lens to make sure you're getting, the most credible, qualified partner that you can possibly get.
Yeah. So I have a question from the audience for you, Patrick. It's specific to Google Workspace. We know, and we've talked a little bit about, I think, the size and scope of the DIB, and there are, a relatively small number of very, very large firms operating in the DIB. There's sort of medium firms, and then of course there's a very long tail of small businesses operating in the DIB. Many of those smaller organizations are kind of either born in the cloud, or if not born in the cloud, migrated to the cloud with things like Google Workspace or Office 365 as kind of core systems for collaboration, for email, for file sharing, for just getting work done, work that involves CUI data, which is at the core of CMMC governance. Talk a little bit about your experience with Google Workspace. You mentioned it earlier as kind of a core part of your business and how you approach CMMC governance. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Great, thank you for that opportunity. I do just want to tack on to what David just said. If you do go and search for a partner or consultant organization to help you through this, be very wary of anyone who knocks on your door and says they guarantee to get you through CMMC. Not a good way to lead, and not probably the right objective. Their objective should be to help you get all the controls in place and then be almost your defense lawyer on your side of the table when you do then go contract an auditor or a certifier or get in that queue. So just a word of caution there. So we are a Google Workspace shop. We're going through CMMC. That's actually a little bit of an oddity. We found quickly that we were in the minority when it came to going through CMMC. Microsoft, of course, Microsoft 365, Office 365, it's much more common. It was thought that they would be more of a turnkey, relatively speaking, for being able to get through CMMC. That may be the case to a certain extent with their GCC, their government cloud. But what we found, the first thing we found is we weren't alone in this quest. We kind of found an underground group of Google platform folks who were government contractors, and we've banded together and we've learned a lot from each other. The biggest thing is that you can do this going through Google. We decided to stick with Google after we thought about this. We were confronted with CMMC, and that was a decision point. Do we stick with Google? Are we going to be able to get through this and continue bidding on government contracts, or do we really need to pivot and go with Microsoft and GCC? So 4 reasons why we stuck with Google. One is we believed Google would catch up. I've kind of said sometimes that Google occasionally arrives late to a party, but when they arrive, they usually bring the keg. And in this case, they are proving that that's the case. So they did arrive a little late, but we found that they installed their head of global compliance, who was the former Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications at DHS, and she was also the Director for Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity on the National Security Staff at the White House. So they're obviously investing in this, and they've come a long way since we were in the middle of CMMC 1. So they are here at the party. And like I said, we found that Microsoft was not as turnkey as folks had thought. There are still some tools you're going to need to bolt on, and some policy and requirements that you're going to have to put some elbow grease into, even with Microsoft. We have folks in our little underground of Google contractors who actually have their feet in both camps, and that's a lot of excellent insight that they're bringing to that and be able to compare how that goes. We also started to hear, of course, at that time that CMMC was going through some adjustments, which we now know is called version 2.0. So we weren't quite as scared with the ability of some short-term POAMs and that sort of thing. So that gave us a little bit of a breath of pause there that we can do this. And like I said, anybody who does this is going to have some bolt-ons. We have found Virtru to be an excellent partner in that regard, helping with some of our email and our file requirements. And they've been super. And there are other products that, whether you go Microsoft or Google or another platform, or you're mostly on-prem, you're going to have a lot of elbow grease to do. So for those reasons, we thought we were in a good space, and we're actually fairly along in the process right now. We've completed our documentation. Again, we're using Neosystems Corporation, and they're very experienced in this. And they've helped us get to a point where we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're getting our POAMs in order, and we'd love to sign up for a voluntary assessment when we're able to do that. So if you're Google, you can do this.
That's fantastic,
so
Patrick.
Feel free to track me down, and Matt, if you're going to send out the contact information later, I'll be happy to ask you to join the underground.
Yeah, no, thanks, Patrick, very much for the perspective, for sure. So Stuart, Patrick just commented on the without sort of suggesting that it's primarily or exclusively smaller end of the DIB that's on Google Workspace or Office 365. Certainly Google Workspace might be more prominent within the smaller end of the spectrum. What about the larger end of the spectrum? When you start talking about the top, I don't know, 10 or 20 largest organizations in the DIB, clearly mature in many respects, often publicly traded, lots of resources, lots of IT, lots of cyber expertise. Is CMMC easy for them? Is CMMC for them kind of just more of the same? They've already been doing this, and there's nothing new that they need to be, contemplating because they've got their houses in order? Or is there something that is worth noting about those really large organizations that are incredibly well resourced and sort of sit at the top of the pyramid, so to speak?
Well, I think there's two components of it. I mean, first, with respect to CMMC, yeah, for themselves, they're generally in pretty good shape. I mean, these are organizations that think about cyber maturity, they think about security, they think about risk. They're not thinking about compliance. And I think that's an important lesson maybe to be pushed down through the DIB when you're approaching CMMC. Don't think about compliance. It's not about checking the box. It's about thinking about what is it that's at risk and what do I need to do to be able to protect it, because it's mine and it also is affecting the national security. I think the part of CMMC that concerns the large organizations, the large primes, the Lockheeds, the Northrop Grummans, the Raytheons, is the ability of those within their supply chain to be able to satisfy CMMC requirements. And I know this is also a concern that the DoD has. It's important to ensure that all of these small organizations, especially those that have very, very specialized skills, are able to remain within the defense industrial base, that they're able to continue to participate in these contracts. And it's also important to the DoD and to the large primes that we're not discouraging kind of startups and innovative companies bringing new ideas and new technologies. We don't want to discourage them from coming in. So, I know there's a lot of effort that the primes have, a lot of them individually, a lot of them collectively through an organization called the DIB SEC, or Sector Coordinating Council, in developing programs for smaller suppliers. I know that individually, organizations like Source America, Leidos, have specific programs for their smaller programs, or smaller suppliers. But to hop on the point that Patrick made, which I think is really important, is Google is really focused on this is a problem. They appreciate that security of the DIB and the importance of enabling DIB organizations is something they have a responsibility to help solve. And we know from some personal involvement that Google is very much involved in forwarding its solutions, but Microsoft is also very involved in ensuring that it can create really affordable, scalable solutions for small organizations that don't require the specialized IT and information security resources that these small organizations have. And AWS is also involved with it. So there's a lot of people that recognize the challenges that first CMMC is addressing, and second, the challenges that organizations in the DIB have in being able to satisfy that, and are working very diligently and very hard to helping solve this overall program. Google, again, is certainly a great model. AWS, Microsoft as well, and being able to address it. But I come back to the first point I made. If anybody takes away anything from this particular session and thinking about CMMC, don't think about compliance. It's not about how I check this box. Think about how is it that I secure the information that I'm entrusted with, and how do I secure the information that I've actually paid to develop as an organization and that I'm looking to get a return from.
Yeah, 100%. And obviously, at Virtru, one of the things we're doing is providing tools to smaller organizations, large organizations as well, to kind of simplify dramatically the process by which you can apply policy controls to data moving in and out of a business. And to pick up on the point that you both made about Google and Microsoft, on a practical level, one of the things we see all the time in conversations with companies, like Patrick's, is sensitivity to cost. Obviously complexity, it's got to be easy to use, and then two, it's got to be affordable. And we talked a lot about how complicated cyber is in general, but for a lot of these smaller organizations, simplicity, elegance, and affordability are really key drivers. Clearly, Microsoft is a phenomenal company with their GCC High capability, and Google, as Patrick so eloquently said, has come to the party now with the with all of the sort of resources that they bring to bear. The good news is for small organizations in the DIB, there are platforms out there that are cloud first, that have really good governance and control, and third parties out there, like Virtru and many others, that can add incremental value to help you kind of move the needle forward. We're close to time. I'm going to wrap things up with a final kind of question to David. Earlier in the conversation, Stuart mentioned that massive amounts of classified and unclassified information has in fact been stolen from members of the DIB. He mentioned the plane that effectively is a carbon copy of which the Chinese produced, and it's kind of like, how did that happen? Like, if in fact the top end, the primes at the top of the pyramid, have mature governance and controls and capabilities already in place and are well positioned for CMMC, then it would imply that somewhere towards the middle or the tail of the supply chain, where the smaller organizations, the specialist, if you will, operating in the DIB, were perhaps the weak link in the digital supply chain that allowed information to kind of get into the wrong hands, so that our IP collectively, our national IP, could be compromised. How do you think about the supply chain? Where's the weak link historically, and how does the CMMC help solve that?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that 800-171 CMMC regime certainly addresses to some extent by providing at least that kind of baseline foundational capability. But I think there are other, there's other guidance and best practice that needs to be kind of addressed as well. As we all know, you don't have to be, the adversary knows, you don't necessarily go out, you don't have to be the fastest, you just have to be faster than the next guy. So they're going to go down the supply chain to the less resourced, to the less sophisticated, actors. I think there is a higher level of sensitization and vigilance up and down that supply chain, but we also see, as we start thinking about the software supply chain and the level of complexity there, you have to look no further than SolarWinds, for example. They were able to, you have nation state
Log4j.
Log4j, and the kind of, open source kind of risk surface that is being significantly and frequently exploited. And so organizations need to not only build a level of, security around both their own custom code as well as the open source code that they're incorporating into their software products as builders of software, but as 800-71 also focuses on as consumers of that software, achieving a level of software visibility. What are you using in your environment? How frequently are you maintaining that in your environment? How are you ensuring that updates have a level of kind of visibility and integrity before you bring them in? Because adversaries are now exploiting those gaps and seams within the supply chain to address them, to achieve a level of initial access and then onward persistence within their environments. And so I think the cyber executive order, 800-171. There's and the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, which is a relatively new NIST publication. There's a level of convergence around software security that needs to be kind of onboarded within these organizations to kind of begin to lower that gap between the most sophisticated DIB members and those further down the chain, so that there is a higher level of kind of integrity end to end within the ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen, all three of you, for being here today. We at Virtru, on behalf of Virtru, we are incredibly grateful for your thought leadership, your expertise, and your willingness to share perspective with the community. I've been in the software game a long time, and I know one thing is for sure: good cybersecurity hygiene is a team sport, and team sports require leaders to share information and best practices with colleagues and others outside. The more we share, the more we learn collectively as a community, the better off we'll all be. Conversations like this, I think, go a long way towards fostering that kind of understanding and hygiene improvement. And aligning with CMMC is clearly in the cards for lots of folks in the DIB in the coming months and years. And as a taxpayer, my hope is that it definitely moves the needle forward. So many in the DIB are doing just absolutely critical work on behalf of the country, for which we're very grateful. So again, thank you to the audience, thank you to the speakers, and thank you for being here today. Have a great one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Here.